All right, so get this. Today's deep dive, we're going back in time, kind of back to the early 90s, to like a moment that I think really shook America to its core, the Rodney King beating.
Yeah.
Do you remember where you were when you first saw that video?
Oh, yeah, it's one of those events, right? Like, it just kind of sears itself into your memory. But we're going deeper than just the footage, you know what I mean? It's like we're opening a time capsule, not just of the incident, but of the America that made it even possible in the first place. And we've got excerpts from Justice Denied, the Rodney King beating, and America's Outcry to, like, guide us through this.
Yeah, heavy stuff.
Heavy stuff.
So, okay, 1991, paint the picture for us. What was the vibe like in America back then? Because the article paints this picture of like all this racial tension like simmering under the surface.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the civil rights movement still echoing.
Yeah, definitely. And you can't forget about like the impact of film at the time too, you know? Movies like Boys in the Hood, Malcolm X, these weren't just movies. They were Black stories demanding to be heard, you know? Reflecting the reality of systemic racism that a lot of white America was just blind to.
Wait, hold on. For those of us who like slept through history class, and I'm kidding, mostly, what does systemic racism actually mean?
Okay, so imagine this, right? Imagine racism isn't just like a personal belief, but it's like woven into the very fabric of like society.
Oh, wow.
It's in the laws, the policies, the institutions. They all end up disadvantaging certain racial groups, even if nobody's like outwardly, you know, being racist. You know what I'm saying? It makes it almost impossible to escape.
Yeah, that's way bigger than just like a few bad apples then, right? Okay, so you've got this backdrop of inequality, and then bam, March 3rd, 1991 happens. Routine traffic stop goes horribly wrong, and our source here describes it as escalating into LAPD officers brutally beating Rodney King, all while some guy named George Holliday is filming.
And thank goodness he was right.
Yeah.
That grainy footage that he captured on his camcorder, you know, turned a local incident into this national explosion.
Right.
And before social media going viral meant something completely different back then.
Right. It aired on KTLA, and then every news channel was replaying it like nonstop.
Over and over.
Talk about a watershed moment.
Yeah.
Because suddenly police brutality, especially against Black Americans, was impossible to ignore.
Hey,
It wasn't hidden in the shadows anymore.
Exactly. You couldn't deny what you were seeing. You know, it wasn't hearsay. It was visual evidence, and it forced a conversation that many had been trying to have for decades.
Yeah. And the reaction was immediate, with like the article talks about no justice, no peace, becoming this like rallying cry. What was the feeling on the ground like, so to speak?
I mean, it was like a collective gasp, right? And then this roar of outrage. People were angry, and rightfully so, you know. Protests just erupted across the country demanding justice for Rodney King and putting police brutality and racial profiling in the national spotlight, you know. Imagine that a time before social media and the message spread like wildfire, fueled by television and this shared sense of like anger and injustice.
It's hard to fathom the impact that one video had.
Yeah.
I mean, everybody saw it. Everybody had an opinion. I remember exactly where I was the first time I saw it. It's like burned into my memory. Did you have like a similar experience?
Absolutely. I remember feeling this wave of disbelief kind of wash over me. You know? Like, how could this happen? How could those officers be so brutal? It was a real reality check, you know? It forced me to confront, like, the gap between what America claimed to be and the lived reality of so many Black Americans.
In that disconnect, that gap between the ideals and the reality, it exploded a year later, didn't it? The article points to the officer's acquittal in '92 as, like, the catalyst for the L.A. riots. 6 days of unrest, property damage, loss of life. It's just a stark reminder of how volatile things were back then.
Yeah, those riots weren't just about the verdict, you know. They were about decades, generations even, of like pent-up frustration and anger finally boiling over. This was about systemic racism, you know, economic inequality, a justice system that felt rigged against entire communities. The acquittal was like throwing a match on a powder keg.
It's heartbreaking to think about, you know, the devastation, the loss of life. But the article also points out that the Rodney King beating and the riots, they weren't just like news events. They left a mark on music, film art. Like they became part of the cultural conversation.
Absolutely. NWA's F-Thigh Police comes to mind immediately. It was raw, it was angry, and it resonated with so many people who felt unheard and unseen. And it wasn't just music. Documentaries like LA 92 revisited the riots, like dissecting the events, providing context. Films like Straight Outta Compton used the beating as a backdrop to tell broader stories about race-class police brutality.
So it's like this incident, this one horrific event became a lens through which we started to view these larger issues.
Exactly. It was a wake-up call, forcing America to finally confront its demons. But the question is, did we learn from it?
That's the million-dollar question, right? Have we learned from this? This article calls The Rodney King beating a flashpoint, not just an event. What do they mean by that?
Well, it's like, the beating itself was horrific, right? But it wasn't isolated. It was like someone shined a giant spotlight on all these problems that have been festering in the dark, for ages. Police brutality, racial profiling, that deep-rooted systemic racism we talked about. The King case just ripped the Band-Aid off and made it impossible to ignore.
So it's been over 30 years. Are we saying those issues are still around today? I mean, things have got to be different now, right?
That's what's so fascinating and kind of disheartening. When you connect the dots to today, yeah, society's changed, technology's changed, but those core issues, they've evolved, they've taken on new forms, but they haven't vanished. Think about the conversations we're having now about police reform, implicit bias. Those are echoes of what exploded back in '91.
It's like the Rodney King beating didn't just spark protests, it sparked a debate that's still raging on today. We see it in the news constantly.
Exactly, and that's what the article means by flashpoint. It wasn't just about those officers, that one video. It was like a cultural earthquake that shifted how we talk about race justice policing. We're still dealing with the aftershocks.
Man, that's heavy stuff. It makes you realize this isn't just history, it's still unfolding. What does this justice denied article say about how we move forward?
Well, that's the big question, and there's no easy answer. But one thing it really emphasizes is the power of that video, right? It forced people to see a reality they couldn't ignore. So part of it is staying informed, bearing witness to what's happening today, but also understanding the context, the history that led us here. It's not enough to just feel outraged. We have to channel that into action, into pushing for real change.
Wow, yeah. It makes you think about what your role is in all of this. It's not just a 90s problem. It's something we have to keep working on.
Absolutely. And remember, it's not about having all the answers. It's about staying engaged, asking tough questions, and never letting ourselves become complacent.
Well said. The Rodney King beating was a tragedy, but it also ignited a movement for justice that continues to this day. It's a reminder that change is possible, but it requires constant vigilance and action from all of us. As we wrap up this deep dive, we hope you'll continue to explore these issues and find your own way to contribute to a more just and equitable future.